Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome. On this frigid morning, I appreciate you being here in person, and we have a lot of folks online too, as I anticipated. So welcome to week 2 of Finding Faith in Hard Times, and we are happy to have Amy Pagliarella in person this morning. So welcome back, Amy. Just a shout out again, after this class, this is the second week, it will go through the 21st, starting on the 28th. We have 3 classes, which are a follow-up to last November's Michigan Avenue Forum. The classes are on combating and the Christian response to anti-Semitism. And then, as I said last week, we have Jeff Doan's class starting on February 18th. Another shout out just to echo Matt about the Michigan Avenue Forum, which will take place in the sanctuary on January 31st at 6:30. It will also be live streamed just in case it's below zero like it is today. The speaker, Robert P. Jones, will be discussing his book and other things. The book is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Future of American Democracy. So we welcome one and all and would love for you to be there. I'd like to start off this morning with a blessing from priest, poet, author, Celtic spiritualist, John O'Donohue, who believes that the gift of the world is our very first blessing. And he says, it would be infinitely lonely to live in a world without blessing. The word blessing evokes a sense of warmth and protection. It suggests that no life is alone or unreachable. Each life is clothed in raiment of spirit that secretly links it to everything else. Though suffering and chaos befall us, they can never quench that inner light of providence. And he has a blessing for suffering. May you be blessed in the holy names of those who, without you knowing it, help to carry and lighten your pain. May you know serenity when you are called to enter the house of suffering. May a window of light always surprise you. May you be granted the wisdom to avoid false resistance. When suffering knocks on the door of your life, may you glimpse its eventual gifts. May you be able to receive the fruits of suffering. May memory bless and protect you with the hard-earned light of past travail to remind you that you have survived before, and though the darkness now is deep, you will soon see approaching light. May the grace of time heal your wounds. May you know that though the storm might rage, not a hair of your head will be harmed. So, dear God, may we all receive blessing upon blessing, and may we realize our power to bless, heal, and renew one another. Amen. All right, Amy. Thank you.
I'm going to offer you, if you don't mind taking that mic with you,
That's
because
right.
we can use that
Exactly.
when if people have questions.
Fabulous.
And then try and just raise your that. Okay, if you have any difficulty, raise your hand, please, or just give me a wave. But hello again, and thank you. I want to give a big shout out to everybody on Zoom. And I want to give a big shout out to everybody in the room who braved today's cold to be here. It is not for the faint of heart. And so I am thrilled that we're able to spend this time together. If you were with us last week, you know that we tried to discuss and not answer the unanswerable question of why do bad things happen to good people? Or put simply, like, why is there evil in the world? Why does an all-loving God allow for a world that is so imperfect? And that's what we struggled with. If you weren't here last week, please know that I answered the question brilliantly. But obviously there is no answer. And so last week we started with this kind of humorous cartoon of God at the computer, and it's a picture of God sitting there with finger poised right over the smite button as a piano dangles over this poor unsuspecting human, right? And sometimes it feels like that. Sometimes it feels like crazy things are happening, bad things are happening. Is God out to get me? Is the universe out to get me? And so when we feel like that, sometimes we kind of play games with ourselves, or others play games with us, right? In an attempt to explain why bad things happen, we say things like, everything happens for a reason. God never gives us more than we can handle. Last week, I invited you to share some of those gems that you've heard. And someone said, somebody who struggled with some very real health issues, said that someone had said to them, how did you sin to have brought this about? For goodness sakes, right? It's bad enough when we're going through tough times. What we don't need is people coming up with platitudes that are meant to, in some cases, help, in other cases that maybe are not helpful, but are meant to try to explain, and that are also meant to try to comfort the person who's saying it, right? Because when we see somebody else struggling and we try to explain it to them, what we're really trying to do is explain it to ourselves. We're really trying to assure ourselves, okay, this terrible thing is happening to so-and-so, but it couldn't happen to me, right? Because I'm a good person, because I pray, because I love God, because from other traditions, because I fast on Yom Kippur, or because I give the proper sacrifices to the gods, right? In a lot of religious traditions, we have this desire to try to explain the randomness of the universe. And sometimes when we do that, we unintentionally hurt other people. And sometimes when we do that, we make it hard on ourselves. And so that's what we're really going to be talking about in the second and third weeks of this conversation. So last week was a lot about trying to explain some of the different theologies and theories that those who came before us have come up with to explain why is there evil in the world. And so we kind of end up with this idea that maybe there is a God, but God is just uninvolved, that God just created the universe and then set us free to our own devices. The idea that maybe God chooses to limit God's self, or the idea that maybe God doesn't really know what will happen. And we played around a little bit with those because I think it's interesting and also encouraging to know that others have tried to find the perfect answer and they too have not been able to do so. But at the end of the day, I think what's really important about all of those attempts to understand is that we come to one conclusion as Christians and as people of faith. And that is that God is like right in there in the bad stuff with us. And God is supporting us in tough times. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And to do that, I want to start with this quote that I shared last week. This comes from Samuel Wells, who is a vicar in London. Absolutely love his writing and his thinking. And he basically sums it up as, what if Jesus is primarily God being with us rather than God working for us? And what I think is helpful about that, what he's saying is not necessarily anything new. Others have said this beautifully as well. But the idea that when we imagine a relationship with God that says, if I do these things, then God will do these things, we're basically creating this transactional relationship with God that says kind of God has to play by our rules, right? If I'm praying and serving and doing all these good things, then God has to reward me with blessings of some sort. And that is, we would know if we had that kind of relationship with our parents or our children or our neighbors, we wouldn't see that as a very healthy relationship. We would see it as more of a like, what's in it for me and you kind of relationship. And so this reminder that if we want to know how God works, we just look to Jesus. We look to Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. And we remind ourselves that if we look at the Gospels, about 90% of the Gospels are stories of Jesus being with people, right? Jesus crying with Lazarus' sisters, Jesus seeing a mother who was suffering because her son had been taken from her, and taking such pity on her and showing such compassion that he was able to raise this woman's son from the dead and restore him to his mother. These are stories of Jesus at work with people, loving people. And that's what Jesus is doing with us now. Now, it then raises this thorny issue, right? Of, okay, so when Jesus was performing miracles, if we believe that in the Bible, why is Jesus not performing those miracles now? And there is no easy answer to that. If people who come next week, tell them I answered the question, tell them I answered it brilliantly. But there really is no easy answer for that. And so the way that I think many of us as Christians come to understand that is Jesus was pretty clear, even in his own time, that he didn't perform miracles constantly, right? There were people who lived in the time of Jesus who died and whose families grieved, and Jesus did not resurrect their loved ones from the dead, because that wasn't Jesus' mission. Jesus' mission was to live on earth for a short period of time to show people who Jesus is, who God is, and to invite people for the rest of eternity into that loving, caring relationship with God. And so that is what Jesus was doing then. And what we're going to talk about today is that I think that's what Jesus is doing now. That very much the idea, because Jesus suffered, because even as Jesus was suffering and dying, crying out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? We know that God did not forsake Jesus, but we know that in that moment, Jesus felt forsaken and alone. And so we know when we're in that moment where we're thinking, what the heck, God? Have you just abandoned me to deal with my grief or my pain or whatever the suffering is that we're experiencing? We know that Jesus knows what that feels like. And that's why Jesus is working with us, trying to comfort us and help us find God's presence in the midst of all of that. And that is, while that's not always it's not always as reassuring as, yes, God will make all things well, that God will make all things the way we would want them to be. I think it's a better understanding of how God works through Jesus. And so if we take as our understanding of God that God is God with us, then we remember God isn't making the bad things happen, that God isn't just allowing the bad things to happen, they just do, right? Because that's the way the universe is. And that God is an all-loving God who is with us in these moments. And the tricky thing with anytime you're trying to say something that's true about God is, well, how do we know that? Well, we look to a lot of things, but first we look to the Bible. And the Bible was written by people who were inspired by God, but who were struggling with the very same questions that we're struggling with. And so sometimes, you can pull something out of the Bible. Today, if you were at the 9:30 service, this adorable boy read Psalm 139. And he reminded us of the idea that we were knit together in our mother's wombs. And even then, God knew us, and that God knew every hair on our head, right? And the idea that God is looking out for us, even from the very beginning. And I wholeheartedly believe that to be true. But the part of Psalm 139 that we usually don't hear in worship is the second half, where the psalmist is pretty angry at their foes and is describing pretty vehemently and violently what God should do to their foes, right? And so it's a good reminder that even the people who were writing the Bible were struggling with this gratitude to God, anger at God, and that's okay, right? The idea that if God is suffering alongside us, that God is inviting us, to kind of let God have it. to cry out, to say, God, why are you doing this? Why have you forsaken me? Even if intellectually we don't believe that God is doing this to us, emotionally it's hard to get past that. And so we put that out there, and we go to God with all of those different feelings. So that's, I think, where this God with us invites us to just be fully human, invites us to ask questions, and invites us to, just let God be with us in our challenges. I want to say too, it also reminds us that God should be with us in our joy, right? Today we're focusing on the tough stuff, but just as God is with us when we're sick, I believe God is with us on our wedding days, when babies are born, when we are just looking around saying, wow, this planet that you gave us, God, is so beautiful. God is with us in all of that too. So let's not forget about that, because I think part of the life of faith, and we'll talk more about this next week, is that in some ways we're sort of building a little bit of an account, right? So that we have something to draw on when the tough times come. And so part of the way that we build that account is recognizing God with us in all the good stuff, so that we then have the capacity to see God with us in the bad stuff. Now, in just a minute, we're going to have a little bit of conversation. But to get to that, I want to, whoops, hang on here. There we go. I want to share with you a story from someone who was really the impetus for this class. A few years ago, I read this book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved. And it's written by Professor Kate Bowler. So she is a professor of church history at Duke Divinity School. And she literally wrote the book on blessed. Her doctoral dissertation was on the prosperity gospel, which is the teaching that some churches follow, that if you truly love God and you do all the right things, that is an active kind of superpower that will require God to then bless you with health and wealth, prosperity and goodness. And so she, in order to do this dissertation, spent all this time worshiping in mega churches that promote the prosperity gospel. And so here she was studying all of this. And at the same time, she was struggling with infertility. She was struggling with some health issues. But then they all resolved themselves. She had a beautiful baby. She and her husband were happy. She got her dream job working at the Duke Divinity School. And so she could be like a proponent of #blessed, right? Everything went her way until she got sick again. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at the age of 36. There's no reasonable explanation why a young, healthy woman, no history of colon cancer in her family, there's no logical reason for why she would become sick, but she did. And they told her it was a terminal diagnosis and they were going to fight it with surgery and chemotherapy, but the doctors were very clear that she was not going to live long. Now, I will tell you, spoiler alert, she is doing great. 8 years later, she is considered cancer-free. She has been the beneficiary of, she's the first to say it, of incredible health, medical care, incredible doctors, access through colleagues and connections to some clinical trials and things that have really saved her life. But at the time that she experienced that, it felt pretty hopeless. And so she wrote a piece for the New York Times that immediately went viral, in which she talked about basically people have a need to explain to her why this is happening to her and to explain God to her, right? And so it was either the Christians who said, well, she must have, you know, she must have done something or God was trying to teach her something. And then her other friends who said, oh, she didn't eat enough kale. She needed to, you know, there were things that she needed to do. Everybody had an explanation because nobody wanted to say everything happens for a reason is a lie, right? Everybody wanted to make sense of it. And while she was going through this experience, what she concluded, and let me be clear, this isn't a silver lining kind of theology, right? I'm not gonna say, oh, you know, she was so sick, but look on the bright side. She learned so much about God and herself. I don't find that to be helpful, nor would she. But what she does say is that while she was experiencing this, she felt a closeness to God that she had never experienced before. And she has said since then that she's a little bit wistful, remembering how she felt God's presence in her life. And she also said she felt God's presence through the people around her, through the people caring for her. And so I'd like to read to you a little bit from her book. So she's talking about after her diagnosis, when she's in the hospital, she didn't know if she was going to survive, but she writes, I felt as though I'd uncovered something like a secret about faith. Even in lucid moments, I found my feelings so difficult to explain. At a time when I should have felt abandoned by God, I was not reduced to ashes. I felt like I was floating on the love and prayers of all those who hummed around me like worker bees, bringing notes and flowers and warm socks and quilts embroidered with words of encouragement. They came in like priests and mirrored back to me the face of Jesus. When they sat beside me, my hand in theirs, my own suffering began to feel like it had revealed to me the suffering of others, a world of those who, like me, are stumbling in the debris of dreams they thought they were entitled to, and plans they didn't realize they had made. That stayed with me for months. In fact, I had grown so accustomed to that floating feeling that I started to panic at the prospect of losing it. I began to ask friends, theologians, historians, pastors I knew, and nuns I liked, what am I going to do when it's gone? And they knew exactly what I meant because they had either felt it themselves or read about it in great works of Christian theology. St. Augustine called it the sweetness. Thomas Aquinas called it something mystical like the prophetic light. But all said, yes, it will go. The feelings will go. The sense of God's presence will go. There will be no lasting proof that God exists, and there will be no formula for how to get it back. So I don't think any of us would wish to go through what Dr. Bowler went through to have that experience of such certainty of God's presence. And yet, how powerful that somebody who really was blessed in so many ways felt God's presence so much more strongly at a time when she was feeling decidedly unblessed, unfortunate, and dealing with so much. And so that's what I'd like for us to spend a couple minutes talking about. I'm going to give you a couple of questions, and we'll work through the folks on Zoom and the folks here in the room. But can you either turn to the people next to you, or if you need to move to a different table so you have some folks. And if this is not comfortable for you, feel free to journal or to ponder silently. But can you think of a time when you experienced God with us, God's presence in your life? And was it in a time of joy, or was it in a time of struggle or pain or suffering? And if you haven't experienced, and not all of us have, we can love God and still feel like, hey, God, you have not shown up for me in the way that some other people have experienced God. Does that encourage you to hear from others who have experienced that? Or does it discourage you? Or how does that make you feel about God's presence in your own life? So I'm going to ask if you're at a table of 2 and that works for you, terrific. If you're by yourself, feel free to move. We can be in tables of 2 or 3 or 4, whatever works for you. We're going to give ourselves 5 to 10 minutes to have a conversation. We're going to go ahead and regroup.
Okay,
And we'll have one more opportunity to talk a little bit with people at the end, and we'll also have an opportunity to ask some questions.
okay.
But I do wonder, is there a group that just wants to share maybe 1 or 2 things that came out of your conversation? Anything from your group?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very briefly. When I was in 7th grade in elementary school, I was going to apply to Lane Tech High School, which had become selective admissions. And in retrospect, I feel God was there because I had initially scored 3rd grade math and 5th grade English, and I had to get that up to 9th grade math and 10th grade English. And 4 or 5 of the guys who applied were shoo-ins because they were simply in the top 1% of the Chicago Public Schools. And over several weeks, they helped me understand complicated mathematics and English. And they were my mentors, and I listened to them. And I eventually retook the test with them, and I scored sufficiently to be accepted at Lane Tech. So as I look back, I said, well, they didn't have to be nice to me. They could just have said that, well, Michael's not good enough. So we're just going to let him go. But they were very, very good to me. And I, in retrospect, see God's hand in the fact that they mentored me and helped me gain admissions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to actually, that's a great lead into something we're going to talk about shortly, Michael. So thank you. But the idea that one of the ways in which God is with us is not only through God's presence, but in God's presence through other people.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that's
Yes,
one of the
yes.
reasons we're all here, right? We could worship
Yes.
God alone, or we could worship God in the community of faith that is Fourth Presbyterian Church, and how
Yes.
much more powerful this is. Yeah, thank you. We'll have time a little bit later too for questions and some conversations. So I want to make sure we talk about this because this is another big thing. I just said that in a way that kind of minimizes it, but this is for many people the real question, right? Which is, we've talked about where is God when I'm struggling personally, right? And we believe in a personal God who knows us. But we ultimately believe in a God who is like the creator of the whole universe. And so the big question that keeps many people from believing in God is, how can a God who is loving, who created everything, create a world in which there's so much suffering? Elie Wiesel, a survivor of the Holocaust and a person of great personal faith, is someone who has written really eloquently about this, because he was a child when the Holocaust began, and he and his family were rounded up, taken to a concentration camp where he was separated from his mother and his sisters. His father died while they were there. He watched so much suffering. And so he has really, through his life and work, kind of struggled with this question. Where is God in a place like Dachau? How can God not only permit that to happen, but the people who were perpetuating the Holocaust were believers in God. They were Christians for the most part. And so how could God allow this to happen? And one of the things he says that's very powerful is I'm going to quote first from an interview I heard with him, where he said that, sometimes people who have read his works were convinced that he abandoned his faith and broke with God. And he says, never at all. He said, it is because I believed in God that I was angry at God, and I still am. So the tragedy of the believer is deeper than the tragedy of the non-believer. Because if we don't believe in God, then we can believe terrible things happen because the universe is just random and there's evil. But if we do believe in God, how do we make sense of why God allows so much evil to happen? And ultimately, in his book, Night, he tells a story that I think is really very similar to what we've just been talking about. Now, for Christians, of course, we understand this as Jesus as a representation of God with us. For Elie Wiesel and for other Jews, it is simply God with us. But he shares a really painful story in which they are watching essentially the execution of a child within the concentration camp. And people are watching in horror as this happens. And someone cries out, "Where is God?" And another person responds, "God is there," and points to the child. And for that person, they said, God is right there suffering along with this child. And for them, that is how their faith sustained them through the most horrific atrocities that humanity could imagine, is the understanding that God with us means that God is right there in the concentration camp, right there on the gallows where this child was suffering, and that God is suffering along with us. So these are for many of us, the bigger challenges. I think when we talk about evil in the world, we talk about two kinds of evil. First, we talk about natural evil, tsunamis, tornadoes, a warming planet, right? And we can sometimes we look at those and they are called acts of God. Insurance companies sometimes still refer to acts of God to explain senseless tragedies that lead to hurt. I don't find that very helpful. We don't think that those are acts of God. We think that they're acts of nature. But when we look at things like natural disasters, we can, even people who believe in God can also look at those and see, well, God created the universe. God created it according to certain natural laws. As those laws take place, there are going to be weather disasters and other natural disasters. There are also going to be things that are human-made or humans have contributed to, right? Maybe we built towns in places where there are more commonly going to be hurricanes, or in our current situation, our planet is warming and we're feeling more extreme weather patterns. You can look at that and you can see that is a human contributed to situation, not something we're going to put on God. But when we do see human evil, we do ask, where is God? Why is God allowing that to happen? And ultimately, I think it comes to what we talked about last week about the idea of God being self-limiting. So God has the power to do whatever God chooses, but we can all kind of see how things would snowball if every time, God saw somebody about to make a bad choice, or God saw a human about to commit a crime against another human. We can see how it would be unrealistic to think that the most loving God could intervene every single time and try to prevent those things from happening. I'll get to it in half a second. Kind of a humorous example of that, if you remember the old movie, Bruce Almighty, the God basically gives God's job to this human for a few days, and the human tries to respond to everybody's prayer requests with, sure, I'll answer your prayer. And of course, the world goes kaflooey, because we recognize that that if God operated like that, it would not be sustainable. Yes, go ahead. Perfect. Yes, be gentle with yourself there.
Thank you. This is reminding me of my favorite C.S. Lewis book called The Problem of Pain. And one of the better examples that he uses in that is that we need the universe to be dependable. God created trees as an example that he uses. And he uses cricket bats, but it's translatable to baseball bats as well. You can turn a tree into a cricket bat or a baseball bat and use it for a good reason, or you can turn it into a weapon. And its nature as a tree, as the wood that it was created to be, remains. We can depend on wood being wood. It's human intention that changes things, that ruins things. And if the nature of wood varied according to the way it was intended or not intended to be used every time it was used, the universe would not be dependable. And I can put up with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks to you and thanks to C.S. Lewis. That's absolutely right. And we think about that. If you think about, we sometimes hear the reference to swords into plowshares, right? Like the metal that creates those items is a neutral resource. The same metal that creates a weapon of war can also create a farming implement. And so we as humans, because we've been given free will, because we have been given the sort of privilege to control our own lives, we're going to take some of the gifts that God has given us and use them in a variety of different ways. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts on that or a question about that? Yeah.
I have a comment about suffering, okay? And yes, I read his book, of course. In my experience with people who grew up with some suffering, whatever that may be, do a lot better with it than people who experience it for the first time, maybe at age 25 or 30 or whatever. And it also brings me to the topic of who suffers. Because I have a tendency to look at people sometimes and think, well, God, they've got it together. Well, look at this, look at that, look at whatever. And then I'm always reminded of how foolish that is. For instance, in my writing group, there's this woman, I thought she was like so great. And she mentioned in her introduction that she had had 12 surgeries because she got into a car with someone who was inebriated and he drove on the wrong side of the road. And that, boom, that brought that back to me so strongly. So I guess what I would say is I think everyone suffers.
It reminds me of, it's sort of a little bit of a bumper sticker quote, but be kind because everyone you meet is fighting a fierce battle. And it's a good reminder that we can't know the depth of other people's suffering. And so let's be kind. Yeah. Yeah. We'll have more questions in just a minute. I want to really bring us to one final thought here, which is, so as much as when we talk about God with us and how God works through other people, and that's next week, we're really going to talk about sort of the so what of all of this, right? What does this mean for us in our faith life, in our prayer lives, and for us as Christians? And one of the things I think it means, which is a perfect segue from what you just said, is we don't know how other people are hurting. And so can we be the ones who help? And I love this quote from Fred Rogers. He says, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And I think of this as a little bit of like the antidote to the, well, God made things happen so we would help kind of theology. And I remember encountering that for the first time many years ago when I was a confirmation leader. And one of our youth said to me, well, my mom told me that God made 9/11 happen so that we would all learn to help each other. So, wow, if that was like the point of 9/11, I think God could have been a lot more direct, right? Like anytime we see, people will, and these theologies are out there, right? If there's a hurricane somewhere there is a minister or someone saying, well, it's because God is upset with, and you can insert anything here. God is upset about abortion. God is upset about homosexuality. God is upset about, fill in whatever it is that this preacher is upset about and attribute it to God. And that is so unhelpful. Theologically, it's not very sound. And also, do we think that if God wanted to get our attention about, an issue in the United States, do we really think that God would send a hurricane to Haiti? It doesn't, it defies all sorts of logic. So no, I don't think, and of course I didn't say this to this lovely young girl in confirmation. I was much more diplomatic in the way that we pursued this conversation. But the idea that no, God doesn't make a tragedy happen so that we can learn to help each other. However, the idea that when something bad happens, what is God doing? God is sifting through the rubble, trying to figure out, how can I help? How can I bring something good out of this tragedy? And I do think that that's how God works. And I think maybe that is how God has always worked. Maybe that's what God was doing with Jesus, right? Because the questions that we're asking here are similar to the questions we ask about Jesus. Okay, God, if you were so loving, why would you send your son, your beloved son, to suffer and die? That's not a very loving thing for a parent to do. And so because of that, again, we try to make sense of it. And some say, well, that was God's plan. It had to happen that way. Maybe. But I think of it more as God sent Jesus into the world because God knew that needed to happen, that the world desperately needed Jesus. We needed the example of Jesus, Jesus' love, Jesus' teachings, everything that Jesus did in his lifetime that would last us for thousands of years beyond that. And the consequence of that was that what Jesus did was so radical and so upsetting to the powers that be that they killed him. And God, being God, couldn't swoop in and stop that, let it unfold. And from that was able to do so much for the good of humanity and creation and the universe and civilization, because now that through that, we have not just Jesus' life and teachings, but the ability to be with Jesus for all eternity, the ability for God and Jesus to be in the world for all eternity. And so that was kind of God, a primary example of God's taking something terrible that's happening, figuring out how can I work with this? How can I help humanity and help creation through this? And so that is, I think, a lot like what we are going to focus on next week is how are we a part of that? How can we be the helpers? How can we be the non-herders, right? The ones who don't say things that minimize other people's suffering, but instead the ones who walk with them through suffering and through pain. And hopefully through all of that, be in a place where we can love God more because we understand the ways in which God is supporting us and helping us. And so I want to pause there because I think we're just about out of time. What I'd like to do is just open it up for a couple of questions and then I'll close us with a blessing.
Amy, I have a question in the chat.
Thank you.
Michael wants the specifics regarding the book, The Problem of Pain, who was the author and what is the publisher? Was that the C.S. Lewis
C.S.
book?
Lewis, The
Okay.
Problem of Pain. I suspect it is readily available on Amazon. So
Yes,
you can
absolutely.
look
So
it up there.
that's C.S. Lewis, Michael. And then he goes on to say, pain, I am told, depends on our definition of pain. It can be subjective or objective, question mark.
Yeah, is pain subjective or objective? I would argue yes and no. Every person feels pain differently. So if somebody tells me that they are in pain and they are suffering, I am going to take them at their word, while realizing that what one person experiences as painful might be experienced differently for someone else. What other questions do you have before we wrap up today?
I just wanted to say that pain, there's physical pain and emotional pain, and some people can bear a lot of one and not of the other. And the other thing I would say, not at the risk of being a heretic here in this group, but I don't know God's mind. And I don't know why God sent Jesus Christ. And I don't know why the things that happened to Jesus Christ happened. And it's not an issue for me.
That's a great reminder. I work with youth a lot. And so a lot of times youth will struggle with certain parts of things. And what I always say to them is there are a lot of people who love God and understand God in very different ways and ask a lot of different questions about God. And that's all good, right? And if you don't understand that, you are in good company, because the gospel writers didn't understand it. Paul didn't fully understand it. I mean, the New Testament is the process of people trying to make sense of what happened to Jesus and why, and we're still struggling with it a few thousand years later. So yeah, there's no perfect answer. Polly, I think we got one more question over here. Oh, and there's someone on the chat?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Michael says, Amy, I agree with you. Chad often does not let one ask or state as fully as they wish. You are correct as to yes and no regarding pain.
Awesome. Michael, thank you. Right back at you. I think you have a good understanding.
It wasn't a question. It was just a statement about faith. I think a lot of this is built around faith, and that's something that we all have to grow that in ourselves, and God will help us. And to me, the Bible has everything we need to grow in faith. But to me, it's all about faith, you know. And there's a lot we'll never understand. But in our group, I thought we brought up something very, very, very important, which is what's foundational is having a relationship with Jesus Christ, or if you want to say God, whatever, but a real relationship. Then you can feel that presence and you can commune, you know, and also you're communing not with like these questions that come up. Often it sounds like people think of God as like a person, like you and I. Let's try to understand this. I mean, God is the king of the universe. You know, we won't know until I think maybe into eternity. You know, the vastness of God. He says, my ways are not your ways. No, you know.
Yes, I'm generally not a believer in platitudes, but the idea that God works in mysterious ways kind of sums it up, right? And so every theology is just talk about God, and it is our best effort to try to explain God while realizing that we are never going to explain God. So I love where you started there with the reminder of faith. I think faith is a gift. Some of us, faith comes easily. Some of us, faith is a slog, and all of that is okay. But it definitely is one of those things that the closer we feel with God, the more that it's going to help us through these tough times. And so I believe ultimately faith is worth working on. I'm gonna stick around and answer any additional questions that folks might have, but I want to close us with a blessing. And since I spoke earlier about Kate Bowler, if it's not clear, I'm absolutely head over heels in love with her. I think she's brilliant. And so I want to close with one of her blessings. She has a book coming out next month called Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day. And she writes blessings for just some of the tough times in our life. And so let's close with these words. She says, there was a time when I had a grip on things, a few decent plans, and even a theory or two about how to keep my balance on this spinning planet. And then life shook me loose. I blinked, only to find myself hurtling through time, through a darkness I couldn't fathom, but surely it must have been there all along. the truth echoing in my ears. We come undone, things fall, gravity itself falls. I am throwing an anchor out into the ether, and Lord, will you catch it, grab it, tether it, pull me into your orbit? Let my eyes adjust and absorb the truth of the beautiful, terrible world you made and we share with the people we love. And when I feel the ground pitching and my stomach lurching, convince me once again that no matter how tiny my place in infinite space, I will stay at the center of your love. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us again this week.